powerful earthquake has left more than 5,000 people dead and tens of thousands injured throughout Turkey and Syria after the quake struck yesterday. The earthquake is one of the strongest to hit the region in more than 100 years, CNN reports, and it struck 23 kilometers east of Nuraji in Turkey's Gaziantep province. This footage shows part of the damage the quake left in Turkey.
The United States Agency for International Development said it was deploying 2 specialized search and rescue teams as part of the American response to these deadly events. The 2 units are based in Virginia and in California. They're the only such teams in the U.S. that work internationally, the New York Times reports.
Meanwhile, host of Pushback on the Gray Zone, Aaron Mate, tweeted yesterday, Syria has suffered a devastating earthquake. This war-ravaged country is under crippling U.S. sanctions. This tweet is in response to what senior U.S. officials Dana Stroll said about Syria in 2019.
The rest of Syria, though, is rubble. And what the Russians want and what Assad wants is economic reconstruction. And that is something that the United States can basically hold a card on via the international financial institutions and our cooperation with the Europeans. So we argued that absent behavioral changes by the Assad regime, we should hold the line on preventing reconstruction aid and technical expertise from going back into Syria.
The Middle East Council of Churches called for the immediate lifting of Western-imposed sanctions on Syria as the current blockage is restricting efforts to provide the Syrian people with help in response to the quake. The council said in a statement, "We urge the immediate lifting of sanctions on Syria and allowing access to all materials so that sanctions may not turn into a crime against humanity." What a monstrous thing that official said. This is a moment of desperation for the people of Syria, that they're suffering.
Well, that was an older quote. That was a pre-earthquake quote. But celebrating the idea that the country through civil war has been reduced to rubble.
I mean, it's the same basic principle.
Exactly. And that's what Aaron Mate is, pointing out here, that suddenly in the face of a kind of act of God, it might become more obvious to people that it's wrong to be rooting for a country to be devastated the way that Syria has been devastated. I think, something like 90% of the country is living in poverty. They've been dealing with famine. Obviously, through just bombing and strife, the country has been decimated even before this. But to be rooting for it in a political war context, but not, but to suddenly realize that the human gravity of it in the earthquake context.
They're rooting for it because they want regime change in the government.
Right.
But is there any evidence that this kind of sanctions policy is helping further the goal? Let's say in an ideal world, that would be great if we could swap out Assad with some preferable government. Now we know that in the real world that is a very fraught proposition, and that we've forced these swaps in the past, and they've not always worked out great. But is it weakening him as the people die and suffer? Does it actually weaken the authoritarian government? I think time and time again we find out that immiserating the country, harming, killing, starving, destroying the people does not actually put them in a position to be prepared to demand changes of their government.
Right.
In fact, it makes them more desperate for their government to provide for them. They're more reliant on the government because we've closed them off from the rest of the world as they're dying.
Yeah, so this is another one of those situations in Syria where we're doing these kind of proxy wars with Russia. And there have been critiques from people like the World Food Organization about the fact that the sanctions have not been narrowly targeted the way that everyone who ever does a sanction claims that they are, and that it has been done very little to actually, thwart Assad or anybody else.
Where's the evidence that Assad can only hold out X more weeks or months or years? There's no evidence.
Right. Well, so the idea is the sanctions prevent, monetary transfers that could be used to, let's say, buy weapons or do other things that the American government says it has an interest in preventing. But the reality is it's preventing the import of food. It's preventing the import of certain agricultural products that are necessary to buy food. Syria was agriculturally independent in relatively recent history. This was an achievement that they really celebrated, I think, about 20 years ago. But now there's certain products like fertilizers that can be used also for explosive reasons. We see this in the United States. There's a limit on how much fertilizer you can buy, like Walmart and stuff like that. So they're dual-use products that are necessary for agriculture that they can't import because of the sanctions. Moreover, there is farming equipment and other kind of technical stuff that they can't get into the country that's preventing them from being able to grow their own food, and on and on and on down the line.
And we know there's a blowback effect to this as well. We know, let's say we only care about, the U.S. policy is only interested in its own national security, not the suffering of the Syrian people. But when you cause people to suffer and to die like this, and they know, and we want them to blame the Syrian government, but how many of them actually blame the U.S. or blame the West and become interested in extreme ideas, or have or that die and then their family members become interested in terrorism or something like that, and then they hate us even more. They want to cause us harm. Like, we know that is a phenomenon that happens.
Yeah.
We've seen that happen. We know our interventions, our interferences, our attempts to wrangle that part of the world and the suffering that causes invites challenge to us, invites revenge.
Yeah.
How many times do we have to learn that lesson before we change course on some of these policies?
Apparently, it's not today. Today's not the day we learn a lesson. It's worth also just noting, saying a little bit about the magnitude of this earthquake. I mean, truly unprecedented. I think we mentioned in the read that it's the first in the region of this size for about 100 years. It's comparable in magnitude to the 1906, I believe it was, earthquake that flattened San Francisco, left basically all of the city destroyed. It was 7.8 magnitude. And when you look at the pictures of the devastation, it's really horrible. There was this viral photo of a father holding the hand emerging from the rubble of what was his teenage daughter who was crushed to death in the quake. It really just is a parade of horribles for the people living in this country. And of course, we wish them all of the best in the recovery. And it's good to see some degree of global unity in sending aid to the region. But as we discussed, the crisis preceded the earthquake, and it will last long after the rubble from the event is cleaned up. Best of wishes to everybody involved, and we will have more Rising for You after this.